Trains have appeared in many films throughout the years, as everything from the setting of the story to being part of a greater action set piece. As cool as these scenes are, not all of these engines are true to real life, and that gets on my nerves. So today, we're going to take a look at everything wrong with the trains in... Before we look at the trains, let's first look at the context. Set in 2009, Chris Pine plays our protagonist, Will, a mentally unstable Pennsylvania man who's starting a new job as a conductor working for his local railroad. He meets his driver for the day, Denzel Washington, and the pair hop aboard their engine and go about their work, with the two just being really passive-aggressive towards each other the entire time. Meanwhile, in a yard across the state, Lester from GTA and his mate TJ Miller are tasked with shunting a train from one line to the next. During the operation, Lester spots a misaligned set of points, and to save time, he jumps out of the cab to change them while the train is still rolling. Lester, however, is so preoccupied thinking about his next big score that he accidentally messes up the brakes and fails to get back on board, leaving the duo to watch the train roll out of the yard. The pair hop in a high rail and give chase while Control calls up redneck Ringo Starr and asks him to throw a switch up the line so that the train can roll safely into a siding. Turns out, however, that as well as fumbling the brakes, Lester set the train to full speed ahead, meaning that it's not just drifting along the line, but actively getting faster and heading towards a populated area. A few near misses later, it's revealed that the runaway has 8 tankers of phenol, whatever, on board, and that should it derail, the toxic chemical could spill everywhere and cause some serious damage. With this revelation, Control decides to try and stop the train themselves with a simple plan. Have another pair of locomotives go in front and try and slow the train down while they lower a guy onto the runaway via helicopter. The plan fails. Our protagonists, meanwhile, passive-aggressive their way into a siding just in the nick of time and together decide to give chase, despite the people in control telling them not to. Another attempt is made to halt the train with no success, and so it's up to our 2 renegade railroaders to stop the train before it derails on a sharp S-bend in the town of Stanton, Pennsylvania. After catching up, Pine goes out to make sure the train couples together properly, only to get his foot smashed between the couplers. Fortunately, he must have been wearing his super indestructible boots, because when we next see his foot, the boot doesn't really look damaged, just got some red stains on it. I know I'm jumping the gun a bit here, but if his foot was caught between those couplers, there would be little left. So in my headcanon, he didn't actually get injured here. His foot just does that sometimes. Denzel tries to brake the train to a stop, but it just keeps going, with the weight and speed of the train burning out their dynamic brakes. It truly does seem like this train might just be... But Pine then suggests manually applying the handbrake of each car to try and slow it down. Denzel heads out to do some old school railroading and leaves Pine in charge of the locomotive's air brake. They approach the deadly bend going too fast, but Pine mashes on the brakes just enough to slow the train, allowing them to successfully navigate it. Oh no, the brakes aren't enough and the train is speeding up again. Good thing redneck Ringo Starr arrives just in time to give Chris a lift. Despite his spontaneously exploded foot, Pine leaps to the truck and Ringo pulls alongside the leading engine, allowing Pine to get back on board and take the keys out of the ignition. The train comes to a stop, there's a press conference, Pine gets back with his wife, and the film ends with a few "where are they now" cards. What an incredible and thrilling piece of media, featuring 2 legendary actors, nominated for both an Oscar and a Critics' Choice Award, and praised by some of Hollywood's most well-known directors. I was laughing the whole way through. Kind of like The Lone Ranger, a lot of this film was shot on real railroad tracks with real locomotives. A total of 9 engines appear in the film, 4 borrowed from the Canadian Pacific Railroad, 4 from the Wheeling and Lake Erie, and 1 from the Southwest Pennsylvania. All of them were given fictional liveries, and a few of them had their numbers swapped out for different scenes where they appear in the background. The locomotives pulling the unstoppable train, 777 and 767, were played by Canadian Pacific 9777 and 9782, with engines 9758 and 9751 taking over as the damaged versions later on in the movie. In order to appear driverless, 777 and 767 were fitted with radio controls, allowing crews to remotely operate them, while in other shots where only 777 was visible, someone would be sat in 767 and driving it in a multiple unit configuration. The Hero engine, 1206, was played by W and LE 6353 and 6354, with a third locomotive purchased from scrap and modified to make it easier to film inside the cab. For various close-ups, pieces of the locomotives were replicated and pushed with high rail trucks, but for the most part it was mostly the engines that were used. Shooting took place on the Western New York and Pennsylvania Railroad, with scenes being filmed in New York and Ohio, but mostly in Pennsylvania. The deadly S-bend that would supposedly wreck the train is the Baltimore and Ohio Viaduct in Bel Air, but the big fuel silos that appear in the movie below aren't there in real life. Ironically, during filming, one of the trains derailed and delayed production for a day while the accident was put right. As well as all the locomotives being real, so too were the stunts. Big respect to Chris Pine, who performed many stunts himself, and Denzel Washington. Despite not doing all his own stunts, he has a fear of heights and stood on top of a moving train as it passed over a viaduct. Director Tony Scott talked with multiple railroad workers in order to better understand how they act, and they even had engineer Jesse Knowlton on board as a technical advisor. Knowlton being one of the guys who helped stop a runaway train during the CSX Crazy 8s incident. That's right, the events of this film actually happened in real life. Kind of. For those who don't know, the Crazy 8s incident was an accident that took place on the 15th of May 2001. I've done a video covering the full story here, but the long and short of it is CSX locomotive number 8888 was being used to shunt a load of cars around a yard in Ohio when the driver noticed a misaligned set of points. He slowed the train so that he could jump out of the engine, set the points and jump back in, but he accidentally fumbled the controls. Turns out he'd applied the block brakes, but set the locomotive to full speed ahead, so the train ended up rolling out the yard and running away down the line. Roughly half the cars were empty, but worryingly 2 of them were tankers full of phenol, which, if they derailed, would have ended very badly. Attempts to stop the train involved people running alongside the tracks trying to jump on, and some tries were made to derail it. Because the block brakes were on, 8888 didn't pick up much speed right away, but these eventually wore out and it began to go faster, managing to reach 52 miles an hour at its peak. An oncoming freight train pulled by engine 8392 was shunted to let the runaway pass, and the crew of the locomotive uncoupled their engine and gave chase. Once they caught up to 8888, they coupled on and braked their engine, slowing the runaway down enough so that someone could run alongside and climb aboard to stop it. In total, 8888 travelled 65 miles in the span of roughly 1 hour 55 minutes. The movie obviously takes some artistic liberties with the original story to make it more thrilling, such as making the runaway faster and adding more tankers of phenol, but aside from the over-the-top action, it's surprising how faithful to the real-life event the story is in ways you don't expect. The bit with the trainload of kids almost crashing? There was actually a railroad safety event going on that day, and the kids needed to be taken home via bus as 8888 was on the line they needed to travel down. Denzel Washington's character mentions how his daughters worked at Hooters, and in real life, Jesse Knowlton's daughters did in fact work at Hooters. Even the route 777 takes in the film, though made up, references several towns Crazy 8 passed through during its runaway stint. Unfortunately, technical accuracy isn't as interesting to the general public as it is to railway nerds like me. So let's start picking apart this film, shall we? Okay, so I'm going to be honest here. I'm not that well versed in modern American railroading procedures or diesel locomotives. I'm on the steam team through and through, sue me. So do bear with me if I miss anything. The first error we get is during the initial runaway scene. After Lester jumps out of the cab, the controls just magically set themselves to full throttle. It's worth mentioning that in the Crazy 8's incident, the engine was also set to full throttle, but this was because of how the dynamic brakes on the engine worked. Here, the engine seems to have been telepathically manipulated for what we can only assume is nefarious reasons. It's worth mentioning too that the throttle on nearly all diesel locomotives is not to prevent the lever from slipping or being knocked on accident, so I'm counting this as 2. Also, the switch was already correctly aligned. The engine seemed to rapidly accelerate as soon as the lever moves, which wouldn't happen so fast in real life, as not only did Lester apply the brakes, but the drag from all the cars would have made its acceleration much slower. The very next scene involves our heroes turning their locomotive around on a turntable, and the way this scene is shot and edited together implies that they're both just spinning round and around for about a minute and a half. After timing how long the scene lasts and roughly estimating how fast the turntable is spinning, combined with the fact it was already turning as the scene started, I estimate that they did 3 full rotations on that turntable, and somehow Will still stopped it in the wrong place. FRA regulations also require that mobile phones are turned off while part of an active train crew, so both our protagonists need a slap on the wrists for that. Shout out to this speed sign that's right next to the bend you need to slow down on. Trains carry a lot of mass, and it can take a hot minute for them to slow down when travelling at speed, so ideally that sign should be about half a mile back so drivers can slow down in time. As the engine passes over this bridge, we get a shot of it swaying side to side. Not sure what the overall standard is for railroad tracks in the US, but last time I saw swaying like that was on the Penn Central. That runaway should have already derailed if that's the quality of the rails it's rolling on. The field trip implies that it's a school day, so why this little girl is standing next to a rail crossing alone in the middle of nowhere raises some questions. Not an error, just, huh? In the scene where everyone finds out the train is accelerating, Lester says he left the engine's throttle in
Notch 8, full power.
But in the shot with the throttle going down, we see he actually left it at a fairly low speed. It only kicks up to full power once he's left the cab. So for him to know it's on full power means he must have telepathically moved the throttle with his mind once he was out of the cab. On top of that, everyone in control is treating the train as if it's simply drifting down the line when he knows it's under power, and yet he doesn't inform anyone of this, rendering any plans they had to stop the train up until now moot. This siding magically manifests when the school train is about to hit the runaway with the points already set. Also, I'm no expert on the correct proceedings, but if a runaway train was heading straight for a trainload of kids, wouldn't the smarter thing be to stop the train, tell them to get off, and reverse to a previous siding instead of, I don't know, risking a head-on collision? There's a chat about deadman switches not long after, and the control lady states that the way it works on 777 is
there's a wand the engineer has to hit periodically or the air brakes are automatically applied. Unfortunately, this train's air brakes were disconnected.
Now, I am aware some deadman switches just apply the brakes, while others full-on cut power to the engine if not pressed. But as someone who knows sweet FA about modern diesels, especially GE AC 4400 CWs, I can't say for certain what kind of switch it has. I was told by my advisors that in this case only the brakes are applied, and since the air brakes aren't connected on 777, then only the locomotive's brakes would come on. Because the locomotives are accelerating, however, there would be only so much the brakes can do before they wear out, just like on Crazy 8's. So technically, as far as I'm aware, she is correct here. If, however, this is not the case, then I kindly ask you ever-enlightened viewers, who are no doubt going to correct me in the comments like always, to please let me know without yelling at me. In the very next scene, we see Tweedledum and Tweedledee try to hop aboard the runaway, and for some reason they try to primarily board the very front of the locomotive. It's not a major problem, but it's also possible to board the locomotive from the rear and walk along the footplate to the cab. Hell, you could also board the locomotive behind that one and use it to bring the train to a stop too, yet everyone is just fixated on the front. This wayside signal has a bell on it for some reason. Guess the railroad really wants to make sure their drivers pay attention. Meanwhile, with our protagonists...
Come back, Zink! Come back!
Frank passive-aggressives Will some more about the fact they picked up 25 cars instead of 20 and puts him on blast for a bit. Yet, at the beginning of the film, when going over their orders for the day, both confirm they're moving 25 cars from A to B. So either they both misread their orders, or Frank is just making excuses to harass Will some more. Whether you blame continuity for this error or the writing, all this bickering is certainly some bad railroad etiquette. Something that just dawned on me while watching this again is how 777 and 767 are both facing the same way. Usually, when running two locomotives together in multiple unit formation, you have the cabs facing the opposite direction so that you don't need to turn them around while shunting, and so that the driver can just go from one cab to the other so they have a better view when running in reverse. You can still have both locomotives face the same way. It isn't wrong, but we just don't do it. Later, we get a scene where Control hammers home to the audience how serious this runaway train is.
We're talking about a missile the size of the Chrysler Building.
This is a bit of an over-exaggeration. Let's do some maths. The average railroad car is between 50 to 60 feet long, so let's just say each car is 55 feet. There are 39 cars that make up the train, plus an extra 150 feet to account for the locomotives, and the total length is about 2,295 feet, making it over twice the height of the Chrysler Building. However, this comparison greatly oversells how big the train is compared to the building, as you could probably easily fit the whole thing in the first few floors if you uncoupled all the cars and organized them right. It's kind of like saying that a piece of string is bigger than a paper bag. Sure, it's longer, but the volume just isn't there. They also greatly exaggerate the amount of damage the train will do. Yes, 8 tankers of phenol and a bunch of diesel fuel won't do the local trout population much good, but the film implies that the explosion from the locomotive's derailing will cause the phenol to go off. The thing is, diesel isn't that volatile. It's why diesel locomotives don't explode when they derail in real life. Saying it's a missile implies it has the capability of leveling a city, when in reality the worst that would happen if it derailed in a populated area is it would pollute a neighbourhood. Probably a low-income neighbourhood too. Trains have always been classist like that. When our bickering couple reach a siding, Frank refuses to enter it, stating the siding is actually 2,500 feet long, and that because they have 25 cars, they won't fit. But once again, doing some maths, even if all the cars were 60 feet long, the train wouldn't be any longer than 1,600 feet, meaning they have plenty of room, so he's just risking his life continuing on for no real reason. Also, I don't know about you, but that doesn't look like 25 cars to me. At 40 minutes in, we get an attempt to stop the train, and boy oh boy is there a lot to unpack here. So, for context, the plan is to have Judge Dredd here drive 2 locomotives in front of the runaway, let it catch up to him, and then use his brakes to slow the train down. Meanwhile, a helicopter will fly overhead and lower a guy onto the runaway once it's slow enough so he can get to the controls and stop it. Pretty solid plan if you ask me. Yet, the film finds a way to make it fail. For starters, the runaway just doesn't couple to Judd's train. Even if the coupler on 777 was closed, as long as the other one was open, then they should still couple together. Wouldn't do the couplers much good, but frankly, I think that's an acceptable loss. But for the sake of argument, let's say that the coupler was damaged earlier when the train hit that horse box. It wouldn't be, those things are basically made of solid cast iron, but let's say it was and now it's unable to couple to anything as a result. As long as Chud was making contact, all he'd need to do is slam on the brakes and let physics do the rest. It probably wouldn't fully stop the train, but it'd certainly drop the speed down to about 20-ish miles an hour. Yet, he keeps taking his brakes off and reapplying them for some reason. Also, did they really need that helicopter? Surely just having a few guys stand on the running board of the rear engine ready to jump over once it made contact would suffice. But no, they'd rather just slam some poor Afghanistan vet into a cab window. Despite slowing it down to 35 miles an hour, moments later the trains managed to get back up to 55. Don't know how it managed to accelerate that fast. The railroad must be putting something in their fuel. Probably the same thing that causes the engine to make this noise. I don't know why it makes this sound, all I know is that it probably shouldn't. And then we get the crash. Oh boy. So, they try and put the train in a siding since it won't slow down, but it's going too fast and causes the front engines to derail. Checks out. But for some reason, the runaway doesn't follow behind. It just ignores the points and carries right on. And nobody could have switched the points as it crossed them because Bub's engine would have been holding them open. 777 also manages to give the leading engine a shove somehow despite no longer being on the same tracks. And when Judd, Jury and Executioner's engines derail, they kind of just roll over. Real diesel engines are surprisingly good at staying upright even after derailing, and because of how they're built, they wouldn't just bounce and roll if they did tip over. Those things are heavy, they'd carve a groove in the ground. Then they just explode. Not even instantly, they actually derail, come to a stop, and then explode. I have no notes, other than they really must be putting something in their fuel. Also, somehow the explosion is big enough that these two, who should be miles away, can see it. The explosion and the loss of his friend, all Judd in the hood, must have shaken Frank up quite a bit, as he forgets how powerful his own locomotive is. He says,
5,000 horses.
when in reality his SD40-2 only has 3,000 horsepower. Pulling into the siding, we get a whole bunch of tomfoolery with the continuity, with the runaway moments away from impact only to jump 100 meters back between every cut. Assuming this is the point of view from the protagonist's engine, then it's safe to say there wouldn't be a direct collision if this was the closest they got, but 777 would have certainly collided with the middle of the train. Then we see the runaway race by when they're only halfway in, and I don't know about you, but I reckon it would have made impact with the last 5 cars easily going at that speed. In the next few shots, the siding seems to be 1,000,000 miles long despite the runaway being right near the entrance when we last saw it, before finally it slams into the very last boxcar of the train, which luckily was only carrying cardboard boxes. During this scene, someone in control specifies that the protagonists need to get at least 10 cars into the siding. Why specifically 10 isn't made clear. I don't know what he knows, but he clearly knows something. And I might as well mention it here since it happens in this scene. Throughout the movie, you just hear locomotives sounding their horns for no reason. Even going into this siding, 1206's horn is just blaring, despite there being no real reason for it. When setting out to catch the runaway, a bunch of characters make a big deal out of driving the locomotive in reverse. But pretty much all modern diesel-electric units are designed to run at full speed both forwards and backwards. The only real issue is the difficulty seeing ahead with the long hood in the way. This guy also makes a fuss about coupling the train at high speeds, but honestly, with Janny couplers it shouldn't really be an issue. It's a fool's errand to try and catch up anyway, since 777 is supposedly going at about 75 miles an hour, but the SD42 the protagonists are in only has a top speed of 65 miles an hour. In an absolutely bewildering display of American problem solving, a bunch of cops form a firing squad and try to shoot the runaway locomotive. Apparently they were trying to hit an emergency engine cutoff button on the side of the locomotive, but that wouldn't work anyway even if they did hit it since the cutoff needs to be held down for several seconds. Man, Hollywood, eh? It'd be real stupid if they tried doing that in real life.
Sheriff's deputies fired shots at the train in an attempt to slow it down.
I used a buckshot round to attempt to engage the fuel safety shutoff switch.
They tried doing it in real life. I cannot give this a ding because this is factually correct. Not long after, an attempt is made to derail the runaway, and this guy correctly explains how the deraillers work. Shame they set them up wrong. The characters make a fuss about the heroes chasing the runaway and how if it did derail they'd crash into the wreck, but it's also stated that they're just under a mile behind the runaway, which for a single locomotive with no cars attached is plenty of distance to come to a stop provided control gives them a heads up. Plus, if the plan was to derail the train, why are all the response crews standing just 20 feet away? This thing is carrying toxic chemicals, I'd be standing well clear. Look carefully at the end of the train and you'll see a bunch of cars missing. To actually slow down the train, Count Dracula here suggests alternating full throttle with dynamic braking. Flipping between dynamic brakes and full throttle in the opposite direction would absolutely ruin the engine and controls. Just slamming on the dynamic brakes and air brakes would be more than enough. Another thing I've noticed is throughout the film, these crossing guards are lowering themselves just as the train passes over a level crossing. Even going at speeds, the barrier should already be down as the train passes by. When coupling up to the runaway, they hit the rear car too hard and cause it to break a seal. I don't know what that means, but I have it on good authority that colliding with a hopper car too hard won't cause it to spray you like this with grain destined for the biscuit factory. While trying to make the pin fall properly to couple the cars, Will gets his foot smashed between the couplers, and since we don't see the knuckles come apart, his foot would be pretty firmly trapped there. Next time we see his foot, however, the boot is relatively intact, just a little red around the edges. That boot would be mangled if it was trapped between two couplers, leading me onto my spontaneously exploding foot theory from earlier. Somehow the air brakes manage to connect themselves. When slamming on the brakes, sparks start flying from the engine's wheels, and yeah, there probably would be some sparks if the brakes were hard on, but that's a little extreme. Even with the brakes hard on, the runaway hardly slows down. Don't get me wrong, 2 locomotives and a heavy train is going to be hard for 1 locomotive to stop on its own, but it'd certainly produce enough drag to slow it down considerably. Even the brakes on 1 car would be enough to put a massive dent in its speed. Frank hops out and starts manually applying the brakes, helping slow the runaway down further, and from the looks of it, he applies the brakes on somewhere between 6 to 10 cars before coming to the flatbeds loaded with pipes. Even this somehow isn't enough to bring the runaway to a crawl. Let me remind you, it took only 1 locomotive and its brakes to slow Crazy 8's and the 47 cars it was pulling down to 12 miles an hour. Even with 2 units hauling the train, all that braking power should have 777 and 767 moving at a crawl by now, and yet they're still moving fast enough to cause the dynamic brakes to explode. Told you flipping between brakes and throttle was bad for the engine. In this wide shot of the train approaching the dangerous bend of doom, the curve it's travelling over here, while not as tight as the bend on the other side of the bridge, is still tight enough that the train could have derailed while going at speed. Yet nobody's really worried about that one. Oh, and I counted 23 cars here, not 39. After being told to hang on to the independent brake, Will grabs the wrong handle, and for some reason they have to wait for the right time to apply it. The brakes on the last few cars are already on. All you need to do is slam on the engine's brake and hold on tight. Yet, as it's going through the curve, Will is told to take them off and apply them again? Because that helps you brake better? Did Tony Scott understand how the concept of braking a vehicle works? Through editing, we see the train go around the bend at least 4 times, jumping back to the start with each cut. Then, in the close-ups, the engines and cars are visibly tilting to one side and balancing on half their wheels. 1. They are not going fast enough into that bend to cause them to tilt. 2. If they did end up balancing like that, they would likely fully tip over. 3. Even if they didn't tip over, the wheels they are balancing on would slip in between the rails and cause them to derail that way. These pipes falling off would probably have caused that car to derail too. The locomotive leans so much that it collides with line-side telephone wires. I don't know if this is an error, but putting those cables so close to an active rail line seems pretty risky to me. And to top it all off, once the train makes it through the curve, it immediately jumps from about 25 miles an hour to 60 in a matter of seconds. Even if all the brakes were somehow magically taken off after traversing the bend, the train would still take a while to get back up to that kind of speed. And yet, even with so many brakes applied, the train just speeds on, leading me to believe that the only reason it's able to go so fast is because the invisible hand of God is reaching down from above and pushing this thing along like a toddler playing with brio. Is that a good explanation for why the things in this movie happen? Probably not, but honestly, it's the best answer I've got. Let's throw on some extra dings, because I've probably missed some incorrect controls, and you're not supposed to wear jewellery while on the job, and let's call it there. Honestly, I didn't think this movie was going to be so error-heavy. I thought this script was going to be a breeze to write, and yet here I am, months behind on upload. Curse you, Unstoppable. Curse you.
What? What in the hell was that?
This film fascinates me. I know I've gone over all the train errors, but there's so much more I want to discuss. Like the creative choices that went into this movie. Because as both a train and movie enthusiast, seeing Hollywood try to take something as mundane as trains and use it as the basis for a gritty action thriller is kind of surreal. Don't get me wrong, I like seeing trains in movies as much as the next man, but they only really work in short bursts, you know? Like an action sequence or as part of a climactic chase. Even something as railroad-centric as Buster Keaton's The General, the trains are only ever on screen for about 35 minutes. With cars, you can have climactic chases, make them jump over ramps, skid around corners, crash into stuff. There's a lot of room to do something interesting. Trains, however, are only really interesting in movies when they crash, since they're more often used as the location and setting of the story. They're not really thrilling unless they're part of a fight or chase scene, and even then it's hard to do an interesting chase with just trains, since the only directions the train can go is forwards or backwards. You can't just shoot out a train's tyres and make it crash into a lamppost, you know? So to make it more gripping, you have to add more stuff going on around the train, and that's exactly what happened here. This movie is so full of action cliches, it's incredible. The lead characters, Will and Frank, despite being regular railroad workers, are basically written as action movie cops. Will's the rookie, the new guy who's down on his luck and is yet to prove himself in the eyes of his peers. Meanwhile, Frank is the seasoned veteran he's paired up with, who runs a tight ship and has his own way of doing things, but knows how to get results. Frank gives Will a hard time until things get serious. There's something big going down, and their chief doesn't think they're cut to handle it. Doesn't want to risk lives and jeopardize the case, but Frank knows from his years on the ground that they need to do something about this renegade train. And after it kills his old partner, well, now it's personal. It's now or never, and so both of them defy their higher-ups to bring this crazy train to a stop. And if you think I'm exaggerating with the whole loose cannon cop comparison, there's literally a moment where a company executive threatens to take away their badges if they don't play by the rules.
Now you stop your pursuit or I will fire you.
You already did.
I know it's an action cliche to have the main characters breaking the rules for the greater good, but when you apply it to railroad workers, it honestly feels like a spoof of the trope. On top of that, you have the mandatory romance subplot too. Throughout the film, it's established that Will's wife is getting a restraining order against him. During the obligatory pre-dangerous mission banter, he explains the nature of the dispute. He got paranoid that his wife was texting an old friend who's a cop. And when she refused to show him the texts, he drove to the guy's house, showed him a gun, and told him to back off. Turns out she wasn't texting that guy after all, and he gets arrested for threatening a cop. When I said earlier he's mentally unstable, it wasn't without reason. All throughout the film he's trying to call her too, which I'm fairly certain is a crime when there's a restraining order in place. But by the end of the film, his wife sees he risked his life to stop a runaway train and decides to forgive him for threatening a stranger with a gun. I know it's just the trope of action movies that the guy gets the girl in the end, but ladies, be honest. If your boyfriend got arrested for acting crazy to the point where you felt it best to get a restraining order, would him stopping a runaway train really be enough for you to forgive him and have another child with him? Who am I kidding? Women don't watch my content. Trains are cool things for badass macho men with exploding feet and marital issues. The rest of the characters only really serve to repeat exposition or act as set dressing. I'm not joking when I say that by the final act of the movie, about 2/3 of the named characters are just watching the plot unfold on the news. A bunch of the railroad workers, Frank's daughters, Will's wife, hell, even the people in control are just watching the TV by the end. And the news just lays on the stakes thick and fast. It's not enough for them to provide coverage of the story. Oh no, they really need to hammer home how apocalyptically dire this train crash is going to be. Not only are there constant reports of how the train is unmanned and how if it derails it'll make a whole fuel depot explode, but the news is so convinced this train is going to crash that even after Will and Frank make it past the bend, a news guy straight up says that the train is still going to derail and they're both going to die.
Speed, it is out of control and has to derail. Frank Arzt and Will Coulson will be the victims of the biggest rail disaster in the history of the Northeast.
Absolutely peak American journalism. Honestly, I'd go as far as to say that the news is straight up an antagonist throughout the movie. Not only do they straight up dox the guy who set the runaway in motion, but somehow have the names and mugshots of everyone involved, and the news helicopters that are following the train actively hinder some of the attempts to stop it. Like, I don't know who's flying this, but there is no reason for this helicopter to be this close to a runaway train. There's a lot of crazy helicopter stuff in this movie actually. For a film about runaway trains, there always seems to be a helicopter present in most shots. I thought this was pretty strange, until I watched the behind the scenes documentary. Turns out, Tony Scott just really liked helicopters. Obviously for a movie like this he needed a lot of aerial shots, but still he was just like, no, more helicopters. Just swooping in and buzzing around all the time. Couldn't just have a guy try to jump from this locomotive to the runaway. Oh no, he needs to be lowered from a helicopter. Why? Who cares? I'm Tony Scott. Helicopters are cool. It's those subtle, over-the-top things that make this movie funny to me. You know, it's not enough to have another train on the same track as a runaway. It's got to be a trainload of kids. The guy lowered onto the runaway via helicopter can't just be some random guy. He's also an Afghanistan war vet. Which, fun fact, the actor playing him is an actual war vet. The locomotives can't just derail, they have to explode too. Even the police response is over the top. The local law enforcement is told to post men at level crossings for public safety, right? So that means every time we see a level crossing, there's at least 4 cop cars there and 3/4 of the Chinstrap Brigade all standing by. And as the movie progresses, more and more police cars just keep on appearing. By the end, there's a whole swarm of them escorting Redneck Ringo and chasing the runaway like it's the Blues Brothers. Hell, one of them just biffs a turn and eats shit for no reason. It's incredible. Such a bold production choice. Speaking of bold choices, the camera work in this movie was certainly a decision someone made. You know how people say Spielberg sees the world in 21mm? Well, this film has convinced me Tony Scott saw the world on one of those waltzers rides while drunk. It is rare the camera stays still in this movie. If it's not handheld shaky cam, it's spinning on a dolly. And if it's not on a dolly, then it's zooming in on something for no reason. Hell, it zooms in on stuff even if it's handheld or on a dolly. In cinema, you usually use these punchy kinds of zooms for whenever a character realizes something or is struck by some kind of reveal. It's snappy, helps draw you in, puts focus on the face. But for some reason, the camera just keeps zooming in during shots that have no business zooming in. People will just be talking or walking somewhere, and the camera is just zooming in and shaking around like it's a Bigfoot sighting. Or spinning round and around during a dialogue scene, like I'm watching the conversation cook in a microwave. And I'm pretty sure most of the dialogue is either open hostility or exposition dumping. Obviously some of it is explaining railroad terminology to the audience so they get what's going on, but most of it is just repeating information we already know. The derailing scene, for example. Frank pieces together that the company is going to try to derail the train. Control Lady is then like, oh damn, they're gonna derail it. Then Sam Witwicky's dad says they're gonna derail it. Later, the news reminds us that they're going to derail the train, and then you get this guy who explains how a derailer works. Just truly magnificent exposition. And I just love how some of the reporters and railroad staff refer to stopping the train as taking it down. Seriously, they talk like they're planning a strike on Bin Laden. Listen.
Tried to stop it. What? We blew it. That train's gotta go down.
It could be coming to our town next, and the high school's right next to those train tracks.
Son of a bitch won't even know what hit it.
Fantastic writing all round. A question I have though is why didn't Frank die? Okay, hear me out on this. Throughout the movie, Frank is set up to have a strained relationship with his daughters, is a few days away from retirement, and acts as Will's mentor figure. Harsh but fair. When the time comes to manually brake the cars, he straight up says,
"Hey, don't get sentimental on me. Makes me think I'm gonna die. Just hold that 4."
Which, if you're like me watching this film for the first time, sounds a lot like foreshadowing. As someone who's watched more than one movie in their life, I expected him to go out, apply some brakes, something goes wrong, he dies applying the last brake or gets incapacitated in some way, and so it's up to Will to finish the mission his mentor started. It's a very typical story beat, but instead, Frank just heads out, applies some brakes, and that's it. Not even a scratch. The setup is there for something to happen to him, but it just doesn't. I honestly can't tell if this is bad writing or an amazing expectation subversion. Press the red button on your remote to vote now. Equally as amazing is the continuity. Shooting started in August 2009, so essentially going from late summer to autumn by the time filming had wrapped. As a result of this, the weather and background is constantly changing, going from bright and sunny to wet and grey between shots, while the trees jump between having all of their leaves and having none. Even the cab of the locomotive goes from looking completely dry to looking like it's just come out of a heavy shower between scenes. If you look carefully, you'll also notice the length of the trains constantly changing and the order of the cars getting muddled around. I'm making a bit of a fuss, but I get it. Filmmaking is hard, and it can be an absolute logistical nightmare to film something, especially something outdoors where the weather can completely screw over any plans you have on a whim. It's why I'm honestly still impressed with the film. In all the behind-the-scenes stuff, Tony Scott seemed genuinely passionate about what he was making. He interviewed real railroaders, used real locomotives on real rails, had real people jumping and running across moving trains, and pretty much everything was shot in camera with little to no special effects, just old-school filmmaking. Even the train crash, Tony Scott straight up said, "I watched every derailment in cinema and thought they were all whack, so I'm going to do my own." I don't really understand his point, because he said the crashes were usually done in sections or with CG or green screen, which is why he wanted to do one for real. But I can list 3 movies off the top of my head with real train crashes in them, so what movies he was watching is beyond me. Also, this one lady in the behind the scenes says,
"As far as I know, no other film has actually filmed in camera a train derailment."
You're working in the film industry on a train movie. Surely that's the first thing you research, right? Why did she say this? Why did they leave it in the behind the scenes? Is anyone still watching this? Quentin Tarantino said in 2020 that this was in his top 10 movies of the last decade, and Christopher Nolan praised the film, citing it as an influence in Dunkirk. And I can't lie, I love it too, just maybe not in the same way they do. The amount of laughter I got out of watching this with my roommate was terrific. The overuse of zooms and shaky cam, the cliche writing, the sound editing, the music, how unnecessarily over the top it makes such mundane things. Even the dialogue half the time is so trope heavy it feels like it came straight out of one of those spoof movies. This film has only gotten funnier with age. Train accuracy, I give a 6 out of 10. For the most part, the trains aren't doing anything goofy or too far outside of reality, but that doesn't mean the movie isn't completely absurd from time to time. Honestly, there aren't that many train movies out there like this. Either they're all grounded in reality or completely throwing out the laws of physics. It's rare a movie is so focused on trains while being relatively realistic. Take that relatively with a large pinch of salt, but you get my point. Could it be more realistic? Of course it could, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as thrilling or as funny if it was. Is it meant to be funny? No. In fact, going off some recent reviews, people still think this movie is a sincere masterpiece. And you know what? If that's how Joe Public sees it, then good for them. But as a train nerd, I see this movie in the same way a paleontologist watches Jurassic Park movies. Is all the science mumbo-jumbo nonsense? Of course it is, but that doesn't make the action any less fun or cool. Plus, it's always funny to see how the script justifies something that you know is total bull. Honestly, I still find it funny that there's that many inaccuracies in the movie, when Tony Scott did that much research on railroads, talking to railroad workers and the like. He even had a train aficionado on hand. Rosario Dawson, who plays Connie, considers herself a bit of a rail fan. But what does she know? Like I said, trains are for manly men, and all she's done is... She's Ahsoka Tano?